All right, I am going to start because we have 1 hour and we have a lot of interesting content to get through and an amazing panel. So we really want to use every minute we have. So my name is Hannah and I am AIDN's Communications and Research Lead. Today is webinar 2 of the Better Giving Framework webinar series. So the Better Giving Framework is a document that we have been thinking about putting together since our inception. AIDN was started in 2018 with the objective of fostering more and better giving from the Australian market to international causes. If you're not aware, Australia is not great at giving internationally, and we really want to make that bigger, better, and do it in ways that are progressive and even become a leader in international giving. And that is what AIDN does. The Better Giving Framework is a document that we've put together after our 5 or 6 years of being AIDN. We've had thought leadership pieces on the AIDN Beat. We have Philanthropod, our podcast. We've had a series of webinars. We have insight tours. We attend conferences, and it's about putting all that data and all those voices together in one document to try and let us inform our network. But most importantly, the document is informed by our network as to what we believe are the best giving principles or guiding principles. So there are 5 principles in the document. Webinar 1 focused on trust-based philanthropy and local leadership, or investing in local leaders. This is webinar 2, where we're focusing on guiding principle number 4, which is a focus on impact. So that is effectively that if you are a giver in whatever sense, impact investor, philanthropist, private funder, or just simply giving a donation, we advise that you, from the get-go, think about giving with impact. And, that is a huge statement. So what does that actually mean? How does one do that? What is monitoring and evaluation? Why is it important to program interventions? That is the focus of today's webinar. So a further few things that, number 1, I'd just like to remind everyone that we are recording today's session, as we will use it as a resource for the Better Giving Framework, and particularly because the Better Giving Framework right now is a draft. So the questions that you give us and the discussion in this webinar will further inform a final version of the Better Giving Framework. And I will also introduce Mark, who is the co-chair of this webinar. Mark is the co-founder of AIDN, and I'll pass over to him in a second. And one final point is that the Better Giving Framework has also come at a very important time. Anyone who's sitting in this webinar probably knows that from January onwards, our entire sector has been flipped on its head, and there has been major global funding cuts coming from every direction. So in this context, even though AIDN has, particularly for our first 5 or 6 years, focused on the more of international giving, how do we give more? How do we get more money from Australia to international causes? And this document is about how do we do it in a better way, a more efficient way, a more impactful way. It couldn't be more timely, in the sense that if there are limited funds being distributed internationally, then it's so important that we are doing it in the best way we possibly can, the most impactful way. So the Better Giving Framework is particularly timely, and so we're really excited that it has not about the funding cuts at all, but about the document and about bringing together all these different diverse viewpoints. So I will pass over to Mark, my co-chair.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and great to see so many people already tuning in, and a really interesting panel here. Yes, my brief introduction. I left the world of finance in 2003 and needed to find something to do. 3 years later, I telephoned the founder of a school in Tanzania. She was standing in the playground as we spoke. I became deeply involved with that school. And that began a journey that saw me managing a number of foundations, always focused on offshore giving. We've donated to big organisations, which we would define as $30 to $40 million size. we've donated to small organisations and even to startups as well. Impact to me, impact measurement, I find it incredibly problematic. One could even say burdensome. On the other hand, it can be rewarding. It can provide satisfaction that your funding is making a difference. However you come at it, though, it's vital, and that's why we're discussing the topic here today. I'm an accountant by training, and that, I guess, means I love numbers, and impact is usually measured in numbers. On the other hand, as a philanthropist of 20 years, I have a lot of sympathy with the phrase that statistics are for lazy people. So for me, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Who do you want to go next, Hannah, for a self-introduction? Hannah, you're on mute.
Great. So with introductions, we'll also ask our panelists to introduce themselves and also with a bit of perspective as to how their work encompasses or engages with impact or monitoring and evaluation. So I'm just going to start with who's at the top of my screen, and that would be Roy.
Hi, I'm Roy Head. I run an organisation called Development Media International, and we do these sort of very large radio, television and mobile phone campaigns, which are designed to change behaviours almost exclusively in Africa. And I guess because we're one of these organisations that just broadcast literally into thin air, that evaluation is really important because you know, you can see a hospital, you can see drugs, you can see a mosquito net, you can't see a broadcast campaign. So it could be doing absolutely nothing, or it could be doing something. So we're known for doing sort of randomized controlled trials and very scientific evaluations of our campaigns to prove that they work.
Great, thank you, Roy. And I will now pass to Sophia.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. I'm Sophia Mahmood, Managing Director at Raising the Village, or RTV. We are a very curious, impact-driven, data-informed organization working to address ultra-poverty in last-mile rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa. A bit about me: my career started a long time ago in Pakistan, my country of origin, in the corporate sector, marketing and community and brand management, but I moved pretty early on to nonprofit and development side. More prominently on the development side, I worked in UNICEF Pakistan and polio eradication unit, and I've been with RTV for quite some time in the livelihood space with a multi-dimensional lens. RTV utilizes data not only as evidence of impact, but as a strategic asset to inform program design, program delivery, optimize costs, and maximize impact. So this conversation is very relevant to our way of working, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Great, thanks very much, Sophia. And I'll now pass it to Anvesha to introduce herself.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. So I am the Impact and Effectiveness Lead at Good Return, a social purpose organization working in Asia Pacific region. And we work to enable women and their families to access opportunity and build financial security. I have around 2 decades of experience in research, monitoring, and evaluation space, and I've worked on different aspects of social sector, on microfinance, on arts, on education, health. And I'm particularly interested in designing and implementing M&E framework and researches that create evidence for future project design and conducting evaluation studies. I love quantitative research, but I'm passionate about qualitative work. I have worked extensively in rural and urban areas in Asia Pacific region, and I've studied economics and I love traveling, both of which comes very handy with my job. And I'm just thinking of the focus area, impact. I think it's the most important thing. It's the only way to learn and improve and create real changes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anvesha. And finally, I will pass to Lisa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Smith, and I'm the Communications Manager for the World Health Organization Academy based in Lyon in France. I've just moved from a role with WHO in Cambodia as their Communication for Health Technical Officer. So across my career in the past 16, 17 years, I've worked around the world in numerous regions in the communication space for UN and agencies, international NGOs, sometimes communicating about development outcomes and impact, and sometimes communicating for development outcomes and impact, meaning things like behavior change campaigns, advocacy campaigns, where communications is a tool, much like the work that Roy does, to achieve development outcomes. But also Mel is equally important in the space of communicating about programs and the changes that they bring about. And in terms of my insight into this particular topic, I will say that one of the defining issues around Mel and the idea of impact is that it so often means many different things to many different people. So often the disconnect comes because it isn't defined early and it isn't defined equally among donors and government and the different organizations working together. And this is often where, things can break down. So it becomes as much a communications issue as a Mel issue. So really excited to be here with the panel and to discuss this really important topic.
Great, thank you very much. Mark, can I pass over to you to lead the discussion?
Okay, let's dive in. And firstly, let me acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I say that on behalf of myself, Hannah, AIDN, and also everyone on the call today. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event today. I pay my respects to elders past and present. So, focus on impact. Let's dive right in. At AIDN, we believe that a key guiding principle for better giving and investing also must include a focus on impact. For Kevin Starr, the CEO of Malago Foundation, he defines it as follows: impact is observable, knowable change, but more specifically, impact is change that would not have happened otherwise. A great piece by Kevin is linked in our Better Giving document, and it's titled "Don't Feed the Zombies." As Kevin puts it, zombies are useless charities that are allowed to survive because funders allocate resources with no accountability, no impact measurement. I must stress, Kevin in this piece is not criticising the doers. As he puts it, it's the funders who are not looking for accountability that allow zombie charities to exist. Kevin says that you can't fund without measuring impact, and that the definition of impact must be agreed between the funder and the doer. On many levels, I know Kevin well, I can agree with him. But he and I do have considerable debate on how you measure that impact in really small organisations. Funders like Kevin, who prioritise impact, argue that perhaps 10% of the budget should be spent on measurement. On the other hand, a startup with $50,000 to spend in a village that's rampant with disease is never going to spend $1 on the measurement of impact. For more on Kevin's thoughts, you can watch a webinar that we recorded a little while back. It's on our website, Why Scale Matters. That's on the AIDN webpage. So a key question to be considered throughout is what drives the need for monitoring, evaluation and learning? Is it informing decision-making? Is it measuring the success of interventions? Or is it just making the funders satisfied? Let's turn to our panel of experts. And Visha, firstly to you, what is MEL? What is monitoring, evaluation and learning?
Thanks, Mark. I will try to briefly summarize the way I think, and I'm sure many people here would already know what MEL is. But for me, monitoring, evaluation, and learning is a systematic approach to tracking a project or program and understanding its impact. And learning here means using information from monitoring and evaluation to make better and informed decisions. It is about truly understanding the deep impact of a program and initiative and then put the learning back in the program and subsequently in the MEL framework. I think there is no start or end point at MEL. It's a constant part of every piece of work. That's what I think.
And by constant part, does that mean it must include not just the people in the MEL office, but program directors out in the field as well?
Absolutely. I think MEL is not a responsibility of a one person in the team, a MEL person, but it's the responsibility of the entire team. Because those who design the project and those who execute the project, they are also part of essentially MEL team because they are the one who are constantly monitoring the project as well.
And Bisha, you've worked at various international development organisations. You've been at CHI, Clinton Health Access Initiative, been at the World Bank. Now you're at Good Return. How have you seen MEL develop or change over the lifespan of your career?
Very interesting question, Mark. I think there has been a tremendous change, and overall, it is evolving. From what we used to say M&E, it's now MEL. Sometimes some people say meal, some MERL, and there are many more now. Well, it definitely started with a, checking the, tick boxing a checkbox. Now many organizations are embedding it in its operation. It used to be a huge struggle to convince the teams to undertake MEL activities initially. Many a time they would consider monitoring visits as like a formal audits and MEL teammates sometimes as outsiders who are auditing them, which is definitely changing now. Second development is emphasis on embedding cross-cutting themes like gender, disability inclusion, social inclusion, climate change, and the work on intersectionalities, as well as there is a constant monitoring and tracking of them, which I think is great. Another thing I see is it used to be bottom up, then somehow MEL started as a top-down approach. And now I think it's getting back to bottom up. So what I feel is that a real big change is when you're working with the participants of a program or initiative to ensure the measure of success is taken into account. So I'll give you an example. In a recent trip to Fiji, a couple of my colleagues spoke to women entrepreneurs. We found that many women entrepreneurs still feel that the measure of success is able to care for their children and spend time with them while running their business. This is also happening in our Indigenous program in Australia. And now we are working with Indigenous entrepreneurs to design their own MEL framework for a project they are part of. I will say just one last thing that I can see. It's been 4 years since I've been working with Good Return, and I feel things are a bit unusual here. For the size of the organization, we bake in MEL from the onset rather than waiting to be directed to do so. Of course, ensuring we meet the funders' needs, but ultimately we do this because we know the only way to truly measure how we are doing is through our data, both qualitatively and quantitatively.
And Bisha, I find that really interesting. So I think we're all familiar with it might be a micro lending program where you might measure the outcomes of that in terms of extra higher incomes for the mothers as a result. But what you're saying is the measurement needs to be broadened into that example you raised of mothers feeling that they have more time to care for their children. So should we be even expanding it, looking into children's health, children's education, and so forth?
Absolutely. I think there is no program which work in isolation, and there's no intervention which is working in isolation. And for some reason, we know that it's not a constant word, but the famous economic term of status quo, we feel that everything else is going to remain constant, but that never happens. We know in practical world, and there is definitely a way that all other indicators should be linked. I always feel that improvement in microfinance, microlending will definitely lead to changes in health outcomes and also education outcomes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to you, Roy. Firstly, if I can remind everyone, should you have questions for the panel, feel free to put them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the towards the end of the hour. Roy, can you tell us a little bit about DMI and if Mel is important to yourselves?
Yeah, it's really important because, I mean, of all the areas of development, public health, is a science. And the people that we're dealing with, or that we would like to deal with, which is the policymakers in international health, they're dealing with the highest level of sort of rigor of evaluation. So, when they recommend a drug for any population, this drug has been tested by randomized controlled trials, the highest possible standard of evaluation. There's a few things, cesarean sections, things like that, which have never been trialed, but otherwise, pretty much everything in medicine or public health is tested very, very rigorously. And there were we, this organization that sort of broadcasts into the ether, and we're telling people, oh, this stuff works, and we've got these before and after studies, which you measure before, you measure afterwards, and the scientists are laughing at us. They're saying, look, this is nowhere near the level of rigor which we need to recommend something. You do a before and after study, it could have been anything that caused those changes. We said, well, it wasn't, it was actually us, and we don't know that, And so we had to, in order to be taken seriously, we had to sort of drag the sort of creative work that we do, kicking and screaming, into the sort of, scientific domain and evaluate it properly, which is why we did. And the foundation that you manage, the Planet Wheeler Foundation, was generous enough to fund the randomized control trial that we did, which was the first trial to show that mass media can actually change behaviors and save lives.
Roy, can you tell us a little bit about? I think you've done 2 RCTs, or you've had 2 RCTs done on the work of your organisation. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah. Okay. So we did. Doing an RCT for mass media is really quite difficult. It's not like giving it to individuals. You have to broadcast a whole area. So you need to sort of pick a country and broadcast in some areas and not broadcast in other areas. And to do that, you need the national media to be quite weak, because you don't want everybody watching the national media, which you can't pick and choose. So we did it in Burkina Faso, which is a country in West Africa, which is really suitable for, its environment was really suitable for a randomized control trial. So we broadcast in 7 areas, and we didn't broadcast in 7 other areas. And the results after 2.5 years broadcasting was that when we did our child survival trial, there was a 56% increase in malaria treatment, a 39% increase in pneumonia treatment, and a 73% increase in diarrhea treatment. And when you put this through a model, it's the gold standard model for that's nothing to do with DMI. It showed just under a 10% reduction in mortality in the first year. And then we did a second trial on family planning, again using the same methodology, and working with Rachel Glenister as part of that Nobel Prize winning team for economics in 2019. And that showed a 20% relative increase in family planning uptake.
Wow. Okay. And was that necessary to do those RCTs to get a response from funders as such, or do funders not care so much about this?
Well, it was funny at first. The RCT for family planning was wonderful, because as soon as we'd done it, we got the British government gave us a whole load of money, $12 million, to do family planning in 7 different countries, which was the perfect outcome to an RCT. That's what you want. When we did it, the first trial that we did for family planning, for child survival, and we got this great result, and it took ages to get funders to respond to it. We were eventually able to scale up in 2 countries, in Burkina Faso itself and in Mozambique. But actually, it's sort of been a delayed reaction, because we're getting much more funder interest now, and so the unrestricted funds, which are the most valuable funds to us, the funds that allow us to do the sort of idealized campaigns that we prepared for, have the funding for that has really increased. So it was a slightly delayed reaction, but 5 or 6 years later, funders are really responding to it. Yeah, so it's been successful in that respect.
Can you think of examples where Mel has been done very well, or you're probably going to say with your own organisation, but also where it's been done badly?
Yeah, I mean, it can be done terribly. I mean, you have to remember that, you can't do this stuff without being allied with academic organizations, but academic organizations don't have the same incentives that we as implementers do. So they'll be satisfied with a measurement, you know, and whereas we as implementers really want it to work. And, you know, I've seen examples where some of the most prestigious, best organizations, so they've done, for example, an evaluation of teenage pregnancy, and they thought, well, it's difficult to measure teenage pregnancy, so we'll take sorry, it was an evaluation of HIV amongst teenage girls, and they couldn't measure HIV against amongst teenage girls because so many people would hide it. So they decided to measure pregnancy, but then they thought that would also be difficult to detect, so they'll measure a bump in a t-shirt, and the whole you can imagine how that went wrong, right? And people put on weight and suddenly were counted as having HIV. You know, it was a disaster, and the organization that was sort of, you know, being assessed was outraged, and they got their funding withdrawn. All sorts of things went wrong, and this was, you know, I'm not going to mention them, but this is one of the most prestigious organizations in the world for doing evaluations. And I've seen lots of cases where, you know, evaluators have sort of measured a slightly different outcome at the end and at the beginning. The two aren't compatible, and they go, oops. And evaluators can often just do that oops thing. And I dread that because, you know, they've got to think ahead, they've got to do it rigorously, and it's no point saying, you know, we made a mistake. And I've also seen organizations, you know, NGOs sort of use background data as evaluation data. So, for example, they'll say in a particular country, look, family planning has gone up by 20% during the time when we've been active. So that's us. And they're ignoring the fact that the entire government, plus about 16 NGOs, are working that space. And they're then claiming that as their own data. So I think it's a really difficult area. It's got to be done rigorously. Numbers are sacred. I think that people shouldn't be throwing around numbers. I mean, I'm you know, when I started in this work, there was a real lack of interest in evaluation. I was at the BBC, and we were doing a project, and I wanted to cancel it because it wasn't working very well. And there was huge pressure, not only from my bosses at the BBC, but also from our funder, the British government, who were funding this project in India, didn't want us to say this wasn't working. They wanted to say to their bosses in London that they'd made a fabulous decision in funding us. And I wanted to say, well, actually, this isn't working. Let's do something else, you know. And now we've got a real interest from donors and from evaluators in the whole space of measuring whether things work or not. I think that's great. But numbers need to be treated as sacred. Otherwise, they'll just become like politicians' numbers, the statistics that get thrown out and that don't mean very much. I really think that has to be protected.
Which, Roy, I remember the first ICT was done by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Yeah.
So if the numbers are sacred, you have to make sure you have a very reputable organisation collecting the numbers. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you also have to, you know, I don't have a science degree. I don't even have science A levels. You know, but you have to take a real interest in it. I know you did. You know, when we were doing this study, you were really, really interested. You did a mini PhD alongside us to sort of, you know, learn about this stuff. And I think that, you know, CEOs and directors of organizations have to really get their heads around it, because if you simply leave it to the reputable organizations, sometimes mistakes can be made, and you know, one has to really get involved quite heavily.
And Anvisha mentioned earlier about the qualitative side as well. Roy, did the people that were out in the field collecting the numbers, did they just collect the numbers, or did they ask qualitative questions as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, you know, when in our world, we're trying to communicate to people to change behavior, sometimes very intimate behaviors like, you know, family planning, reproductive health. It's extremely intimate. Some behaviors are quite easy, like, you know, just take your child in an emergency to a clinic. That's a relatively easy behavior. But in order to persuade people, you need to know how they think. You need to know why they're not doing this. You need to know, you know, what are the barriers. So, I mean, in that RCT, I think we did about 4,000 focus groups. I mean, we've moved beyond focus groups now. We've had some advice from a very good guy called Bob Hornick, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're trying to measure now quantitatively, you know, what the barriers are to communication, to behavior change. So the problem with focus groups is that sometimes you get 10 reasons, some of them interesting, some of them not very interesting, why people don't want to comply with a particular behavior. But you don't know quite what to do with that. Which are the most important ones? You can't address all of them. So we've used some quantitative methods as well to try and look at that qualitative data to find out which mindsets correspond most closely to behavior change.
Great, thanks, Roy. We might move on to Lisa. I'll just remind everyone, should you wish to put any questions into the chat, you are more than welcome. We will get to them towards the back end of the hour. So, Lisa, you've worked in communications for development. I'm gonna guess there's probably some overlap with the sort of thing that Roy has done, but if I'm wrong, you're going to correct me in a moment. Can you tell us about your roles at the World Health Organization in Cambodia and in France?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the work I've done in various organizations, but specifically with WHO, does cross over quite a bit with Roy's work. I think for this discussion, the most pertinent area is the work I did in Cambodia as a communication for health technical officer. So key to that work was the fact that the WHO's mandate is to work with governments. So our mandate is not to work at community level, is not to create interventions at community levels. That has, during COVID, there was, blurred boundaries with that work, and certainly that in conflicts and disaster zones there's also, we move more operational, but the core mandate of WHO is to work at systems level and is to work with governments to change things at that level, which meant that the work that I did around behavior change was as much about coming up with campaigns, focusing on different health outcomes and health impact, as working with my government counterparts to take them through this process and show them how working in a evidence-based way can create change and can create measurable change that they can report on, both to their bosses but also to donors and different funders. So that's a whole other sort of layer of difficulty when it comes to this type of work. My government counterparts, as I think many around the world, are used to, there's a problem and we want to do a communications campaign, and donors generally will give us, money to print posters and to create TV ad spots and radio spots. And that's where they jump to. They immediately jump to producing the product and rolling out a campaign. And as everyone here has discussed, you can't actually measure then if there's been any change in knowledge or attitudes or behaviors along the way, when all you're doing is reporting that we disseminated 30,000 posters. Or so I worked with government in Cambodia on a few different campaigns. Probably one of the key ones was around, it was much smaller than the work that Roy has done, but we did a targeted campaign of youth in Phnom Penh, 18 to 25-year-olds, on the overuse and misuse of antibiotics. And this was part of a broader campaign around antimicrobial resistance, which is considered by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 global health threats. I think just one key thing was, we went in at this campaign not talking about antimicrobial resistance, which is this big concept that's very confusing to many people. And we tried to go in at a much more targeted level around the misuse and overuse of antibiotics. And we got some really good results. We achieved a good amount of impressions. We did, we used various survey instruments to show, change in knowledge pre and post campaign. But the main sort of outcome was that we worked with our government counterparts, and we worked also with a local behavior change lab, and we took them through this effectively MEL process where we tested. So we did a youth hackathon, came up with ideas. We did a behavioral analysis around the use of antibiotics amongst this target group. We then developed concepts. We tested. We went back. We came up with a campaign with various videos and tools. And before we even released that, we tested again. So it was very much about that process of showing MEL, as everyone has said here, is not something you just tack on at the end to see if change has happened, that it's something that you have to do repeatedly throughout, and it's very much part of the whole process. But that can have challenges when working with government, because they also want things to happen quickly and they want to see things happen immediately. And of course, also the thing about doing these things well is that it can often take much longer than before.
Lisa, with an organisation as big as WHO and governments, I can see why you would test rigorously, retest as you're outlining, and back and forth, back and forth. Do you have any experience with smaller organisations and how this might work for them?
Yes, yeah, so absolutely. So I will say, for big multilaterals, big UN agencies, MEL can actually be quite difficult, because they're trying to create frameworks often and guidance that can apply globally or regionally. I mean, WHO, impact measures are based on health outcomes at national level. So the MEL framework tries to show that very difficult thing that Roy pointed out of, WHO's work can contribute to a reduction in mortality, or, and trying to apply MEL tools and methodologies that across 190 countries can be very difficult. So often the best MEL teams I've worked with have been in some of the smaller organizations I've worked at. So ABC International Development, Red R Australia, these are places where the MEL is, as Aveshna said, completely in the DNA of the organization. It's been embedded there for a long time. And also there's a really strong connection between the MEL teams and the communication teams, and how they need to work together to jointly tell the story of impact. That's also been really important. So there's a real necessary way of bringing those two teams together. And in Red R Australia, indeed, both teams were part of the strategy and impact team. So I think, smaller organizations can, they can be more agile, and they can apply frameworks in a, very much more specific way, and tools in a much more specific way. And I think that's really valuable. It also shows how things can, work at a smaller scale before you do go to scale at a bigger level. But of course, again, bigger organizations, as I said, they're looking to create systems change. And systems change is never going to happen in a 3 to 5 year funding cycle. It's decades and decades of, before you might actually see impact, or like what can be seen as measurable impact. So also creating MEL frameworks that can work at a systems level, I think is particularly challenging, and not something that I've attempted to do, but it's something I've attempted to try and work within, and it can be a very big challenge.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Let's move to Sophia Mahmood of Raising the Village. Sophia, you're in Nairobi today, I believe. Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Heading to Toronto tomorrow. Just for the record,
Yes.
Hannah's in London, Roy's in London, Lisa is in Lyon, and Visa, you're in New Delhi, and I'm in Melbourne. So truly global today. So Sophia, what role has MEL played for Raising the Village?
All right, I'll start with some context about our program. So Raising the Village, or RTVR program, we address ultra poverty in last mile communities, and our program is multidimensional. It's centered around improving household income and production for subsistence farming communities, primarily through climate resilient and sustainable agriculture. But we address the multidimensional barriers our partner communities face around health, food security, financial inclusion, gender equity, etc. With the objective of creating broader economic and social agency, so communities can continue to grow after graduating from our program in 24 months. Now, we have been able to achieve remarkable impact consistently at a significantly low cost compared to traditional graduation models. According to our own impact data, our partner communities have achieved 6 times the return on investment at 24 months, which has continued to grow up to 18x at 60 months, 3 years after graduation. And a recent RCT study, you'll get to see the results later in the year, also validates that our program is as effective or more on certain dimensions, but at a fraction of the cost. And the question we get asked most often is how? And that is where I would say the role of MEL comes in, data-informed development. Now at RTV, we don't call it MEL. Like Anvesha mentioned, there are different names to it. We call it Venn, like the Venn diagram, because it's really embedded. It's, Venn or MEL and program is really embedded deeply together and work together very well, because Venn or data-informed decision-making is embedded in our way of thinking. It shapes program design, program delivery, and program delivery then feeds into our data systems for learning. So when we talk about MEL being embedded in our theory of change, studying the causal links at every level of the outcome, identifying what is driving the intended impact throughout program delivery, and then making sure that through our own custom-built apps where we are right now, implementing staff have that information. They're self-reporting, monitoring progress on those impact drivers, and then they're getting insights on how to prioritize messaging as well as coaching, which households to prioritize more, which are struggling with achieving those impact drivers, which could be adoption to practices like WASH or good agriculture practices that we have studied will have the intended impact at 24 months. So I would say that what makes us agile, scalable, cost-effective, Venn or MEL has a lot to do with it.
Gotcha. Okay. So has your approach changed at all along the way?
For sure. I think the vision was always embedded since inception, but of course we've changed a lot. In 2016, when we were working in a handful of villages, we were doing, paper-based data collection, and of course our M&E framework wasn't so robust. I think around 2018, we moved to open source digital tools. And fast forward to 2022, 2023, we're building our own custom apps. On the analytics side, we started with descriptive. Okay, let's see what's happening. Then we advanced to diagnostic. Okay, let's understand why it's happening. And now where we are, we're working on predictives. Based on this data, what will happen? And prescriptive. Okay, what to do about it, and feeding those insights to the hands of implementers. And when I say implementers, the idea is, okay, right now it's RTV staff. In certain areas, it's also government workers who are supporting the program delivery. Eventually, what does it look like in the hands of community champions themselves? And I would say, referring to your better giving framework, trust-based philanthropy has had a huge role in our evolution from, a regular paper-based approach to where we are today.
So you've referenced trust-based philanthropy. Another is backing local leaders. Do you have considerable local input into the makeup of the questions or whatever the process is, how you go about assessing your data?
Absolutely. I think localization is so critical, not just from a program delivery perspective, but MEL perspective as well. So, and it's not just about data collection, it's about the whole design of the framework, contribution to the whole, shaping the theory of change, designing your framework, your survey instruments, collecting data, analyzing it. So that's sort of the whole continuum And I would say that, so our regional headquarters is Uganda, and our entire event team is based out of Uganda 100%. And wherever we have pilots in other countries, we have, depending on the size of and the scale of the pilot, we have some local M&E arm reporting into Uganda, where predominantly the analysis takes place and development of apps.
Are there challenges finding local MEL expertise as such? Do we need to build that capacity on the ground?
Sure. Workforce challenges of different kinds, they're there in every country, in every context. And we all know, we've been working in this sector, that historical context and systemic challenges contribute to what's possible in each context. But I would say, if we look at what is in our control, as a sector, we create the demand for certain skills, and it takes years to build those talent pipelines. And I would say that's where the opportunity lies. I would even go as far as saying that more than an opportunity, it's a responsibility of ours to invest, to build those talent pipelines and the skills, because otherwise you can't be scalable. If you're scaling, your MEL has to be scalable. If you want to be efficient and effective, your MEL has to be local. And if I may, we have first-hand experience. I hope one of our colleagues is part of the attendees, but I can cite two folks on our event team. They joined us in 2016, 2017 as M&E officers. They were developing the tools, they were collecting the data in the handful of villages in Kisoro where it all started. They were doing the analysis. Today, one of them is the head of the department, managing a team of 35. One of them is heading our data insights and innovation unit, working on really advanced machine learning models. And they're honing the next generation, and already honed the next generation of talent. So it's definitely possible, and it's quite remarkable.
Gotcha. And Sophia, do you have much interaction with funders at all? And to what degree are funders, are they all over this? Does it depend on the funders?
Yes, I do have interaction with funders, especially from the reporting side, as well as the technical side of things. I would say that we've been very fortunate that as we've grown and as our MEL and our approach has grown, with unrestricted funding and funders who've had the shared sort of investment and vision of what it means, have been a part of this journey with us. Of course, because we collect so much data, and funders may have different focus areas. So we're able to sort of translate and respond. But when you talk of restricted funding, I think that adds its own challenges and customization, and in a resource constraint setting, right? So it does have its own challenges, but unrestricted funding has been instrumental in the way M&E or MEL or VEN in our organization has evolved, and what it is today.
Great, thank you. I'll hand back to Hannah in a moment just to see if we've got any questions on the chat page. But I just recall Anvisha earlier was talking about the need for not just quantitative but qualitative, and I will highlight again, there is an incredible amount of information already in the AIDN website stored there from previous AIDN Beats and webinars and so on. And Matthias Nestori of Life You Can Save contributed a piece for us some time back, titled Navigating Complexity, the moment that defined how I conduct impact evaluations globally. Yeah, Matthias tells a story of when he was involved in an impact evaluation, and how he realized that you had to treat participants not just as data points, but actually ask them why they thought an intervention is working, or I guess not working. But anyway, hopefully before the end of the chat, we might be able to get that. The end of the hour, we might be able to get that up on the chat. Hannah, over to you. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, we have two questions. Now, this first question is from Vicky Taylor, who is from Results International Australia, which is an advocacy NGO working to leverage more funding and better policies for the world's poorest people. They advocate for increased Australian government funding, Australian government to fund key multilateral initiatives such as the Global Fund, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, Global Partnership for Education. Now, they know that their advocacy helps to move millions of dollars, but they have found it difficult to measure attribution versus contribution, especially when operating on a shoestring budget for MEL. So Vicky would like to know, how would you suggest we present our work and impact to prospective donors, given the nature of our advocacy work and our lack of budget in this space? So I thought maybe I would pose that to either Anvesha or Roy, a little bit, who might have some understanding about how to measure something complex like advocacy. And then it also speaks to something that Roy brought up, which has come up a few times, about unrestricted funds and funding for MEL. And that's actually something that AIDN we promote, that there's one thing, and that's saying to funders that convincing them that the MEL is really important and that it's complex, but there's a whole other thing is, will funders actually give money specifically for MEL? So I'll go back to the original question. Anvesha, I think you can see it in the chat. Do you have any advice for Vicky about measuring advocacy work?
Thanks, Hannah. I think Vicky has posed a very classic challenge of MEL when you have limited or no funding, which used to be a huge challenge, I would say, few years back, but I think the things have improved now. People have understood the importance of MEL and how the donors also understand that if they need to invest in MEL, otherwise it will be hard to measure and put results at the end. So if you already have numbers, Vicky, if you have certain numbers as if you have a MEL framework, first of all, where you know what you have been tracking, what had been intended outcomes from the project, that's a perfect start. If you do not, that's a problem, I would say, but still there are ways to find it out. There are methodologies that you use. You can do outcome harvesting. You can go back into the participants of the program and understand what had been the impact of the program for them, what has been your intended outcome versus incidental outcomes from the project. Here, qualitative research is extremely handy. I agree with Roy that numbers are sacred. You have to respect them, place them correctly, but qualitative come very handy in understanding the perspective of those numbers. So I would suggest, as a short answer, I'm very happy to discuss it at length with Vicky, that go back to the participants, ask them about what had been the benefit to them from the project.
Great. Thanks very much, Anvesh. Yeah, go, Roy.
Add something, Hannah, because I just think that monitoring evaluation, as you described, can be really expensive. You can spend quite easily. You can spend tens or even $100,000 on evaluation. That's impossible for many organisations. And if I could just make one really cheap suggestion, is that governments naturally collect lots of data and it's free, and so it's perfectly possible to do a really good evaluation where you're paying for your own, you have to pay for your own staff costs to do the analysis, but the actual data is free. And the best data that we got in our randomized control trial was the data that we got for free from the government. And you could easily, if you do an intervention in one or two areas or three or four areas and don't do an intervention in three or four other areas, you could even create a randomized control trial, for free, if you use government data and, assuming they're measuring the stuff that you're interested in. So I would just put that out there as a way of doing stuff really cheaply.
It's very relevant, because I was just about to pose to you Sarah's question, where she says running RCTs comes at a very high cost and often beyond the capacity of smaller organisations. How can we manage funder expectations that RCT are a must? And do you have alternative reliable practices for smaller organisations? Additionally, how can we help organisations have agile MEL systems that can be flexible to evolving with funding interests, including unrestrictive in nature?
I think this is a really good point, but the first thing to say is a randomized control trial is, it is a very, very sophisticated way of evaluating something, and you use it in particular circumstances, and you only use it when you're ready, when you've actually got something you're pretty sure is going to work. Otherwise, it's a lot of trouble, and you can get egg on your face. But I do think that just basic before and after data is good enough for some funders, as long as it's plausible, as long as you can't come along when there's 20 organizations working in a particular field and say, look, here's the before data, here's the after data, and hey presto, haven't we done well? I mean, that's just not plausible. But if you're the only organization working in a particular field or in a particular area, and you do before and after data, then that's very, very plausible. So you can do that relatively cheaply. And then I would use, I would focus, surveys are expensive. They involve people going around with data collection devices, and that's inevitably extremely expensive. And if you can use existing data that is naturally produced by your activities, if you're measuring attendance at school using school registers, a lot of the time administrative data collected by government or collected by organizations who are actually on the ground is reasonably reliable. Sometimes it can be really reliable, and often your size of data. I mean, when we did our trial, we had 600,000 consultations that we were getting data from that was just naturally produced by the health system, and it was free, and that's incredibly powerful. And so I would just really point people to looking at that free data.
Great, thank you very much, Roy. Lisa, I have a question for you. Lisa, could you please hypothesize as to some of the impact metric organisations could devise which speak to systems change? And then Lachlan goes on to give a bit more context. That is, the thinking here is around how to engage philanthropists in giving towards long-term systems change in the midst of their desire at time for a 3 to 5 year sustainable end game or exit strategy.
Sure. So and Vesha may be better posed for this question, but what I can say about MEL, like understanding MEL for systems change, and I think, what everyone has said here today, understanding of a basic theory of change, you have inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact. And the way, for instance, WHO, WHO, as I mentioned before, ties its impact to national level data. So it's not data produced and as Rory said, it's not data produced or managed by WHO, though we support the government to collect this data, usually during like 5-year household surveys or 10-year household surveys, and monitoring of the health system broadly and widely. But an example would be, let's say you want to fund a reduction in infant mortality. So that's your impact. You want to see a reduction in infant mortality. The things that contribute to that are manyfold. That can be an increase in vaccine uptake, an increase in skilled birth attendance, during birth. It can be a decrease in diarrheal diseases. It can be, a decrease in communicable diseases. So in order to get to that long-term impact, because you're not going to see a decrease in child mortality, on a national scale, that is sustainable. Again, you're only going to see that over decades of data collection. You have to then decide which of those outcomes do you want to potentially fund, and through what organization, and then understand their theory of change to achieve those outcomes. So when I say that WHO supports systems change, the point is that we don't just support the vaccine uptake. We're supporting government across all these different outcomes that we will then, we know through time and time again can lead to a reduction in infant mortality. It's of course not there's many other factors. This can be all very context specific to different countries. But I will say, as a communications person, I never in my life thought I would work for a organization full of doctors and scientists. And I wonder sometimes if it's a natural place for me to be. But my colleagues, this is their passion. This is what they, you know, that drives them, is this evidence-based. We never, WHO will never make a sort of leap to say that something has led to something, because I have 20 colleagues behind me who are critically assessing all that data. But again, they're often doing that over many, many years. So just in terms of funding and how you want to look into funding, if you believe that you can support ending infant mortality, that's fantastic. But if you're going to fund a small organization, recognize that they're going to be having a very small part in that, and it can be a critical part, but you have to make sure that you understand how their part is going to lead to that longer term impact.
Great. Thanks so much for that very comprehensive answer, Lisa. And it is already, well, it's 7:01 where I am, but it's, I guess, 4:01 in Australia. We've got one final question we can do really quickly because it's a great question. And I'm going to pose it to Sophia and Anvesha. And that is from anonymous attendee. Great to have you here, anonymous attendee. I'm interested in any tips the panel may have for balancing rigid donor reporting expectations, for example, KPIs, deliverables, and the unique characteristics of place-based work and their implications for MEL. For example, centering First Nations agency and leadership in MEL. So I'm going to ask both of you to give one quick suggestion to that very simple, one-dimensional answer question.
I'd go first very quickly. I think what has worked for us is having the right partners. It would not be possible without having a shared vision, a shared understanding from the get-go. Otherwise, if you don't have that opportunity and you have very rigid funder reporting requirements, I totally appreciate and understand that it becomes almost impossible to do the work the way you intended to do it.
Great, thank you. And Anvesha, do you have one final suggestion and then we'll wrap up?
Can I say a suggestion for the funders first? In a situation like this, I would actually strongly suggest that to the funders who might be in the audience listening afterward, please do not impose your own framework. It's better if you work collaboratively with the partners as what works for them and design the frameworks collaboratively. It's challenging afterwards to track and to report when the organization is not working on particular thing. So that's the first thing. And if you're not satisfied, if their appropriate systems are in place, offer support in this area. There are many local and international specialists in the space, and international organizations often support the local partners to develop contextually relevant processes. And again, I will emphasize on quantitative. Look for quantitative. The numbers get parked, but the stories live. They get passed on. They are shared, and do regular monitoring and reporting. Essentially, do not leave it at the last at the end to complete the reporting and make the project report.
Great, thank you. That was a really great answer and I think place to end on. So I will say thank you to all our attendees, and of course a huge thank you to my co-chair Mark and the panel, Roy, Sophia, Anvesha, and Lisa.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you.